It is impossible to be in the Canadian and television film industry and not have heard of our first guest. He has been a film distributor. He has been a film producer. He has been the recipient of the Order of Canada. You can find out more about movies from talking to this man over a cup of coffee than you can if you spent the entire day surfing the IMDb. In just a few moments, we're going to have that conversation when we sit down and talk to producer, Canadian icon, Mr. Robert Lantos. I'm Thom Ernst, and this is Making Movies, the Canadian way. Thank you, Mr. Lantos. Our guest, Robert Lantos. You may not remember this, Robert, but we've met once before in your office, and we had a great conversation about a great film that I rewatched again this week called Sunshine.
I do remember.
I
remember everything that has to do with that film.
It's one of your personal favorites, is it not? Sunshine?
Well, it's the most personal film I've ever produced, yes.
And that's because it dates back to your own personal history from Hungary. And
well, it's a story that spans 3 generations of a Hungarian Jewish family, and which has some parallels to my own family story, but pretty much any Hungarian Jew could and does say that.
I want to be proud of my own language. I want to look out of the window and see a country that I know and love.
There can be no forgiveness for what happened here.
You can play an important role in shaping this country's future.
Well, you know, it's funny. I'm glad we're on the topic of Hungary and Hungarian Jews, because when you look at Hollywood, early stages of Hollywood, and you look at the Zhukovs and all those people who started there, Hungarian Jewish people started the film industry, making it what it is in Hollywood. Along comes Mr. Robert Lantos in Canada and does the same for us. You had to leave Hungary at a very young age because of the revolution.
Well, first of all, I'm not going to take credit for starting the Canadian film industry. You can't put that burden on my shoulders. No way.
You could take credit for making it a little more commercial. You brought Tom Berenger in with Praise of Older Women, and you've brought in a lot of stars into the cinema. You brought them into Canadian film. You made Canadian film a lot more recognizable. I mean, you could be humble about it, but I think I could toot your horn for you if you let me.
You know, so what I still think is arguably the best or one of the best Canadian films ever made when I was in university. And it was The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz.
Let me see.
And I was at McGill, and I saw it in the movie theater, and I thought, if we can do this here, it was like one of the most inspiring moments I ever had, and that I never really thought. I took film courses in university. I have a graduate degree to show for it, but I never really thought seriously that it could amount, that there would be any real practical application, certainly not in Canada. And then I saw The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, and that's when I thought the dime dropped, and I thought, we can do this right here. If we can make this movie.
Right.
That precedes me. I was in school.
But, you know, and for those who don't know, that was a Ted Kotcheff film, was it not?
It was directed by Ted Kotcheff, with whom I later worked, and it was produced by a man called John Kemeny, who is no longer with us, who later became my partner.
Yes. And true, that movie, for those who don't know, that movie starred Richard Dreyfuss. And at the time, for a Canadian film to have a star that came right out of American Graffiti was quite something. And then Tom Berenger shows up in Praise of Older Women. And I remember seeing that film and being quite moved by that as well. And then you went on to work and shape the careers and work with so many great filmmakers from Adam McGoyan to David Cronenberg, Jeremy Podeswa. I mean, we could go on. Certainly you saw an opportunity in Canada for cinema that others weren't necessarily seeing.
Well, it's sort of like this. I tried to get a job at the National Film Board when I was finishing at McGill, and they wouldn't have me. It's a funny story, but a man called John Grierson, who coined the word documentary and founded the BBC and the National Film Board, in his twilight years was a professor in graduate studies in film at McGill. And he was a professor of mine, and we had there were only 7 of us in his seminar and class that he held in his hotel room in a kind of shabby hotel on Crescent Street in Montreal, where we all drank copiously during his anecdotal lectures. And he, at the end of the school year, he asked all of us what we were planning to do next. And when it was my turn, I said, I am going to ask you to set up a meeting for me at the National Film Board. And he said, then what do you want to do there? And I said, I want to write, direct, produce, and I'm going to show them my student films, and you're going to write me the most phenomenal letter of recommendation. And he said, this is a really bad idea. He said, because he said, if you want to work there, you should go to the front desk, to the receptionist, fill out a form to apply for a job as a driver. They have a high turnover in drivers. You'll get a call within a year or two, and you'll get in, and then you work your way up. The other way, he said, it's really, you're not going to get anywhere. So I didn't take his advice. I insisted that he set up a meeting. He did write me a wonderful letter, and he set up a meeting with the then commissioner of the National Film Board, who served me high tea. And then after high tea, he took me for a walk. He said, come with me. And he took me to the corridors, through the corridors of the National Film Board, and he opened several doors, and some of them had people in them, in their offices, and he would say, this is so-and-so, and he's a producer, he's been here for 11 years. This is so-and-so, he's a director, he's been here for 22 years, and et cetera. And then, with no further explanation, he then took me back to his office, said, now please sit down. He said, now all the people you've just met, they're all waiting for an opportunity to make their next film. And many of them have been waiting for years. Do you really think we're going to hire you to come in here and write, direct, and produce? That's what led to my entrepreneurial spirit. That was my moment, that was my revelation, that was my moment of realization that I had to do this myself.
Yeah, a lot of people would have been had the wind taken out of them with that kind of introduction. It just fueled you.
Well, it said to me that I wasn't going to get a job. Mm-hmm. So if I wanted to somehow find my way into making movies, I had to do it on my own. And so I found ways over time.
A lot of Canadian filmmakers, and just being Canadian itself by nature.
Oh, by the way, I'm not a very good driver, even to this day. Had I been a better driver and taken John Grierson's advice, I probably would have gotten the job. So.
Right. Well, I'm glad you're a bad driver. And I have no proof of that, but I'm glad you're a bad driver. A lot of people do it. Yes. Yeah. A lot of Canadians and a lot of people we've been talking to have been involved in making film said one of the issues with being Canadian and trying to get a movie made is that we're too polite, even as filmmakers. You get the Tarantinos and other people that will push, and we just heard Piers Hanley talk about Michael Moore sending his film in, and that Canadians, as just by the nature of who we are, just don't do that pushing. Is that something you had an advantage over, maybe? Because you didn't have that sort of need to be quiet about your talents?
Well, are we talking here about the content of the movies themselves or the personality of those who make them?
Well, we're talking about the personality who make them, but I'd be interested in the content as well.
Well, because I think the content of, if you're working outside the the mainstream Hollywood studio system, where movies are made for the sort of largest common denominator on a global scale. If you're outside that and you're making independent films for a more narrow audience, whether it's in Canada or in Norway, you know, regardless of where in the world, if you're going to resonate with audiences, if you're going to find space in the public eye, then you need to make films that are not down the middle, that are good or bad. Sometimes they're bad, but never down the middle. The down the middle, that road is so monopolized and fully taken by the major studios and their, whatever their current fixation is right now. It's comic book movies and superheroes. There was a time when it was sci-fi, or banana peel comedies, but whatever their flavor of the moment is, that road is occupied. So I've had this conversation countless times with Canadian filmmakers, or when I've taught class sometimes in various film schools, and I've said, if you aspire to be a filmmaker in this country or anywhere else in the world outside of the blockbuster system, then don't waste your time with an approach to storytelling that's down the middle, because there is no room down the middle.
Yeah, no room for creativity, no room for
not
oddities.
Down the middle.
Not
There is room in. There is, so that's what the edges are for.
So that's why you came here. I mean, you're at McGill. That was one of the reasons. So you're already here. But instead of going down to the States, you weren't interested in down the middle films.
You know, I can't sort of even say that. You know, I think it was more naive than that. It wasn't that well thought out. It wasn't strategic like that. I was very young, you know. I was in my 20s. Here's what I know. I managed to get my first 2 films off the ground. The first one was a little-known movie called L'Ange et la Femme, directed by Gilles Carle, and made on absolutely no money at all. And the second one was In Praise of Older Women, which at the time was a very big hit worldwide. So having done this, having made one film that was a hit, and Warner Brothers picked up the worldwide distribution rights, and they invited me to come to the studio, and they offered me a housekeeping development deal, which translates into they were going to give me an office on the lot and a secretary and some money to develop scripts with, and that's it. Now, I was at the time, you know, I was 26, so it was exciting. I was maybe 27. I don't want to make myself younger, and so I sort of let myself be wined and dined for a few days, and I walked around the lot thinking of myself as a future Hollywood mogul, and I felt really good. And then I kind of spent some time with other people who I met who had similar deals, and I realized I would be out of my mind to do this. I had, at a very young age, made a movie in Canada, 2 movies, but particularly In Praise of Older Women, in which I never got a single note from any studio executive. I never had to kowtow to anyone. Did raise the money, it was a pain in the ass raising it from, $5,000 here and $10,000 there. But I, along with the director and the writer, we made the movie what we wanted to make, and we cast whoever we wanted to cast, and we shot in locations we wanted to shoot in, and did not have to ask anyone for permission to do anything. And why would I, having done that, throw a mortgage all of that in order to find myself in Hollywood and ask for permission to go to the bathroom, which is what everybody had to do, and certainly have an entire committee of executives involved in every single decision. So once all of this sort of became clear in my head, I said, I'm not, I'm staying where I am, and I'm going to make my life and my career where I live, which at the time was Montreal. Now, looking back in hindsight, and I thought, for the first couple of times out, it was, particularly the second time, it was very successful. So I also thought that, I thought I was a genius. I thought I was, I knew really, I knew what I was doing. I understood how it all works. So armed with that confidence, and with the sort of, I said no, thank you to Warner Brothers, and which at the time was a very contrarian thing to do. It's not, but most people back then, if somebody in Hollywood even returned their phone calls, would immediately be on the next flight. I came and continued my career here. Now, I said it was not a strategic decision. It was naive. It was naive because I had no idea how challenging and difficult it would be to really sort of to make movies and to build and to turn that into not just a way of creating and having fun, but actually turn that into a business in Canada. Had I known the challenges ahead, had I known that my next 3 films were going to be flops, had I known all this, I probably would have taken the Warner Brothers deal. But I didn't.
Yeah, and I would have loved to know what their faces were like when you went and say, yeah, I'm going back to Canada. This Hollywood thing's not working for me.
Well, the one guy who was one of the vice presidents, who was vice president of production, who had offered this to me, he said, you're out of your mind. You're going to regret this. We're giving you, a golden opportunity. Why would you want to be in, what did he say? He said, why would you want to make movies in the colonies when you can come here to head office? Like I said, in hindsight, he had a point. I didn't, but at the time, that just spurred me on.
Yeah, and when you're talking about hindsight, you're talking about hindsight maybe from the point where you weren't having the successes, but you are a success now. And that would not have happened if you stayed there.
Or it might have happened on a larger scale.
Yes? I don't know. I mean, it got to the point, though, where you're making Canadian films, and it used to be, I used to think that, in order for a Canadian film to do good, they wanted an American star. But no. When it came time to make Barney's version, okay, we are only talking a few years back now, Dustin Hoffman wanted to do that movie. It wasn't like you had to chase Dustin Hoffman to do a Canadian film. Because of a lot of the films that you made, and I am giving you, this credit because, you're here, and I do appreciate what your films have done for the industry. So we've gone from a time where we seeked out and wanted to get American attention to where American talent was seeking out us. So they can now, even though this isn't one of your films, but being in a Philippe Faurdeau movie or a Denis Villeneuve film, or do Barney's version. So it did change the face of the Canadian industry.
There's no doubt that we've come a very long way since I made my first film in 1977, and that we command a great deal more respect, not only in America, but all over the world. Canadian films have won top prizes in Cannes, in Venice, in Berlin, all the world's great festivals. Some of mine have. Mm-hmm. We've been nominated for the Oscars pretty much every year for the last dozen years. We have made the film world equivalent of the Olympic finals and have won medals. And so we have proven that we are among the best, and we get respect now, mm-hmm. which was not the case when I started. Like I said, when I started, anybody in Canada who could get a single phone call returned from Hollywood was gone on the next flight.
Yeah.
So we do now have, we have respect, and we have a range of talented people in front of and behind the cameras. So a lot of them still go to LA, and so then we bring them back. But we certainly have an industry now. We did not have one when I started.
Mm-hmm. And we still don't have what I think a lot of people would like to see, and actually there's a lot of controversy whether we need it, but a Canadian star system. First of all, is that possible? And part two of that question, is that necessary?
Look, we have a Quebecois star system.
Absolutely.
Okay? The reason you say we don't have a Canadian star system, well, because we work in English. And so that's a shared language with the United States. So our stars are their stars. I think we do have a Canadian star system. It's just that Hollywood calls them theirs. I can name you, a dozen Canadian-born stars, from Ryan Gosling and Ryan Reynolds to Seth Rogen to Keanu Reeves to it's a long list. They're all Canadian, and a lot of them started their careers in Canada. Now, they get paid more money in LA. And the weather is a lot better. So they tend to hang out there. But I wouldn't say that we don't have Canadian stars.
Okay. But still, if we were to put out Patricia Rozema or even Adam McGoyan, who, of course, everyone in Canada can recognize, or everyone who loves film in Canada can recognize, not necessarily is that going to translate across the border.
Well, you're talking about directors.
Well, there is the directors, and then, of course, there's performers. Nadia Lutz, for example, I was going to say Hugh Jackman, but that's not who I mean. He's American.
We can't play him. He's
Hugh
Australian.
Dillon. I meant Hugh
He's
Dillon.
Australian.
Yes, yeah. Sorry?
Hugh Jackman is Australian.
He's Australian, absolutely right, yeah. So there are stars here, but one of the things is we don't celebrate them the same way. A story somebody told recently about the late Jackie Burroughs was that she just won the Genie for Wintertan, and the next day she had to go to work as a maid cleaning houses. I mean...
I don't know that, so I hope it's not true. But
it is. Well, apparently it's true, and that kind of story sort of suggests that maybe the star system in Canada is not quite working yet.
Well, look, we have a particular sort of geographic and language problem here. It's also an advantage. I'll explain what I mean. We have this border with the world's leading manufacturer and exporter of entertainment, film, television, music, you name it. And we are, from their point of view, we're even part of their domestic market. There's no other country in the world that faces that. Certainly not in Europe, not the Australians, not the Latin Americans, not in Asia. We're the only ones. So what that means is whether it's a movie or a television series or a song, whenever a piece of popular mass entertainment hits the radar in the United States, that same nanosecond, it also hits the radar in Canada. It doesn't, but in this internet age is beginning to change. But nevertheless, for it to get on the radar in France, it has to be dubbed into French first. So an American movie doesn't play in France, except it plays in French. So that creates a barrier, or in Italy, or in Germany, or in Spain. Even in England, where the language is shared, but the geographic proximity is not, and the pronunciation and the choice of words is so different in Britain that there is a domestic culture in British movies, certainly in French, Italian, Spanish movies, that is so distinct and so separate from what Hollywood does that it commands its own market share. We don't have that in English-speaking Canada. We do in Quebec. We don't in English Canada because we speak the same language. We are geographically tied to each other. And when an American movie is marketed and promoted when it's released in the US is being marketed, that marketing, that massive tsunami of advertising spills right over the border onto our television sets, our magazines, if they still exist, I'm not sure anymore, and into our billboards and our subways, and we are subjected to it simultaneously. So we face a real, and always have and always will face a real challenge in creating our own distinct and separate star system and our own distinct marketplace. Something that no other country in the world has. Quebec doesn't have that problem, which is why Québécois films do much better at the domestic box office than English Canadian films. But there is an advantage to this, as I was going to say. I'll come back to it. And Québécois films, however, don't do anywhere nearly as well internationally in the marketplace as English Canadian films do, for the same reason, because they're in French and they're very specific to Quebec, to Quebec culture, to the Québécois sensibilities, to the Québécois humor, and that occasional exception being France doesn't travel anywhere near as well around the world as an English language movie.
Yes.
So that's the flip side.
So when we will always be under that shadow, I guess, that monolith. That's the the American sort of marketing tool. And yet, if we don't go down the middle, I'm going to use your term, and we do films like Being Julia, A History of Violence, Eastern Promises, which I actually really love. I think that was one of Cronenberg's best. We are giving a voice to Canada that we haven't been doing before, because now it's not just going down the road, and it's not just Ontario, it's not just Canada-centric, but Canadian films could branch out to Hungary. Like Jeremy Podeswell's film was international film. Yeah. Fugitive Pieces, yeah. So we are reaching a bigger market. We're because we are multicultural, we can tell many different stories then and reach a different audience then.
Well, I think what we do have is the know-how to tell stories of universal interest. Sometimes there are stories that are specific to the Canadian experience, and sometimes, as some of the films I've made, like Sunshine, like Fugitive Pieces, like Eastern Promises. About Fugitive Pieces is sort of half in Canada, half in Greece.
Yes.
But several other films I've made, Being Julia, you just named, they really don't have anything to do with the Canadian experience. No. They just are being made by Canadians. And I think these both are fine. It's like to have we need choices on the menu, and so sometimes we tell Canadian stories. Sometimes we tell stories that have are not specific to us, but of interest to us because they're of interest to everyone.
Yeah. What was it about Cronenberg that you saw so early on that you really sort of latched on to him and decided that this is?
Well, we work together intermittently, not always.
No.
We made 3 films together: Crash, Existence, and Eastern Promises. He's incredibly talented. Nothing else. Mm-hmm. He also happens to be my neighbor. Oh, he lives 1 block from me.
Okay.
So it's convenient when we have meetings.
Yeah.
But it's just he's a brilliant filmmaker.
And he's grown. Also, I think when you look at his work, it's expand from genre filmmaking, which is great in and of itself, to these sort of mind-bending films. Well, Existence is a perfect example. So there is a progression then with the filmmakers you work with.
Well, David got me. His early films that's sort of not my cup of tea. Very kind of straight-out horror movies, but he really got me with starting with The Fly.
Yeah.
And then Dead Ringers. That was. Can we use 4-letter words on this?
Well, we'll let you. Yeah. Yes. I just got the ear saying sure.
That was the most perfect up movie ever.
I just want you to know that's a 6-letter word.
You're right. Touche. So that's what got me.
Yeah. Where you are now in your career and where you told us where you began, that journey you took, can be done again. Like if somebody is starting off in their career, things when you're making movies, it's changed so much, not just how we make them, but how we consume them, how we see them. Can that same journey be made? Is your job, is it going to be different years from now? Should somebody even venture towards the journey you made?
Not in the same way, because today, and it pains me to say this, but it's the truth, movies in general play a much a much lesser role in most people's lives than they did when I started out. And independent films in particular, the kind of films we make, have receded into the background and have become an endangered species. So not in the same way. I think that opportunities are plentiful, but I think that today they involve making television shows. I don't think that simply wanting to only making independent films is, if I were starting now, I would certainly not do that. And I didn't. I made a lot of television series, and I ended up building a company that did both, navigated back and forth between film and television. And then I sold it, called Alliance. And pieces of it remain active today, although it's been resold many times since. But today even more so. I think that it depends how ambitious you are, but if you really are ambitious, then I think that television canvas is at least as important as film canvas.
It's almost even taken over. I mean, you're suggesting that, and in a lot of ways, well, HBO had the best saying. It's not television, it's HBO. I mean, there's a whole different way of telling stories on TV now.
Yes, and Netflix and Amazon and etc.
Yeah.
So we have and they in turn are clobbering a lot of the box office of independent films.
Yes.
Because that same audience that would go out and watch watch one of our movies is now watching House of Cards or or whatever it is that they're watching, Orange is the New Black, or whatever it is that they're watching. These options were not available in the past. And the films that are suffering the most are the films made for grown-ups. The ones that are suffering the least are the superhero movies and sequels, which are made for kids who still like to get out of the house, especially on the opening weekend. And those are the films that, and the films that really require a big canvas, the 3D movies and IMAX movies. The films that, those are the ones who are still sort of suffering the least from the sort of new competition, which is not just television. I mean, it's the internet. It's the plethora, cornucopia of options. Video games are a much bigger business than the movie business.
Yeah.
I mean, video games didn't exist when I started making movies. I remember the first video game. It was, it was Pong.
Yeah.
You went like this, and that was the only one. And that's what was it. That was the video game.
Yeah.
And now
I got very good at that, by the way.
Yeah. You did.
Yeah.
I take you on.
All right, we'll get a Pong game in here and we'll do that. Because it is fascinating that the industry is changing so much. And I mean, are we mad at Netflix or any of these, or is that just life? It just progresses in a way that it's going to progress.
We can't be mad. It's sort of evolution. It's like saying I have some favorite places in the world, and I go to them 20 years later, and they're completely changed. They're full of condos and high-rises, and what's all this doing here? And then you say, well, it means more people are coming. So it's the same here. I mean, in fact, the sum total of all of these new delivery systems is that more people are coming.
Right.
They're just not coming to the movie theaters to see independent films.
But there's still a reason to make them. I mean, as you say, they're films for adults, which is different than adult films. And the Netflix and those places give these movies a kind of a second life, albeit, though, they may be buried beneath a lot of other films.
The truth is that that's not the raison d'etre of whether it's Netflix or HBO or Showtime. They do show movies that have played in theaters, but more and more. Again, if you turn the clock back a dozen years, then the main staple of all of these networks was theatrical movies, which had finished their theatrical run, and then they ended up on whether it was, even in the early days, Netflix and sort of pay television. But it's not the main staple today of HBO or Showtime or Netflix or Amazon. They do have movies, but that's not how they promote their service. They don't say, buy Netflix and you can see You can see my movie Sunshine, made 20 years ago. That's not how they market their service. No. They say, we have all this original programming that you can only see on Netflix and nowhere else.
Right.
And that is why people buy it. So feature films are very, very much the sort of subordinate players. They're the backbench. You know, they go, that sort of gets on during, what do they call it in sports? Junk time? Garbage time. Right.
Okay.
I mean, this is harsh, but it's true.
Yeah.
And it's more true now than it was a year ago, and probably even more true a year from now. You know?
But then the film festivals, and you were talking to peers.
And you don't want to hear this here. You want me to give you a positive, optimistic message.
No, I don't. You know what? It's fine. If you have a positive one to give,
I think, you know, you can tell stories on. You can now tell. You don't have to tell a story in 90 minutes or 2 hours. You can take 8 hours to tell it, and design it in such a way that it will end up on one of those other delivery systems.
But not everybody's going to want to go back and see these films again and again and again. I mean, you know, follow the chapter film. I mean, there's one very popular series that I just didn't bother watching because it seemed like it was going to go on forever. It didn't, and I think there is still an interest in good cinema, and which is why we have so many great film festivals, not just all over the world, but here in Toronto. And people are seeing those films.
They are, and every year there are 2 or 3 films, usually the ones that have a lot of Oscar nominations, that manage to sort of break through the sort of inertia, and get audiences to go to the movie theaters and pay money at the box office. But they're very few in number. And the companies that made their name and their fortune with independent films no longer exist. Miramax, New Line, it's a long list, USA Films, Artisan, Paramount Classics, Vantage. I could sit here, a long list of films of the companies that the biggest ones, the most sort of best known ones in the independent world were Miramax and New Line. Well, they don't exist. And they certainly distributed a lot of my movies. Between them, they distributed, I think, 15 films that I made. But they don't exist anymore. And that, you know, that world is it's a shrinking world. It's a much smaller world. Look, I'll give you a story, and then I won't say anything more depressing anymore. But, you know, when I was in my early 20s, you know, and if there was a new film that opened that weekend by Bergman or Truffaut or Louis Malle or Fellini or, you know, one of the great filmmakers, it was everybody my age sort of made a point of seeing the film as soon as possible, if not on opening weekend, then a few days later, and we all talked about it. And not just those of us who were studying film, but people who were in medicine, people who were in dentistry. I mean, it was the thing to do, to go see non-Hollywood, non-mainstream movies. And, you know, today, the only ones who do that are people my age. When I went to see the last Bergman film, Sarabande, which he made shortly before he died, it was playing in a little tiny theater that was at the time owned by Adam Egoyan. It had about 40 seats, and it was on a weekend. It was the opening weekend. It was half empty, 40 seats, half empty, and I was the youngest person there. And this is only a few years ago. So, and I realized, looking around the room, the people who were there were the same people who were watching Bergman's films when they were 20, like me. There was nobody else there. So there's no reinforcements. That's just sort of people who are, other than hardcore film buffs, young people don't have the same fascination with that kind of a quirky storytelling. Or if they do, they watch it on television.
Okay. I mean, I'm believing you because you've had the experience, that you've been there. The wealth of film knowledge that sits in that chair right now I can't challenge it. But I'd like to think that because film schools and film studies are very popular, and
film festivals, as you said,
film festivals.
And there's a plethora of film festivals all over the world. And that's become the alternative market for films that are for independent films. It's film festivals. That's where people see them. So, but it's a strange phenomenon. You'll see, there's a film that plays at TIFF,
Yes.
and it will be sold out. Every screening sold out. People are lining up, hoping to get a ticket at the last minute. You know, there was a hysteria to see that film. When that film opens in theaters 3 months later, no one's coming. That's not an unusual story.
No.
That's, you know, there are exceptions, but those are the exceptions. Usually that's what happens. So film festivals create that, are the magnet that bring in those who have an interest in films that, you know, that are not about how many, you know, about car crashes and airplanes crashes and going to, you know, and that are not about sci-fi, don't have superheroes. You know, they bring people out, but then the actual films themselves, only really those that go all the way to the Academy Awards, those still do. But really it's a handful, it's only a few.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Lantos. Before I let you go, I want you to tell the audience, and if there's one Canadian film they really ought to see then.
Well, look, that's a tough one to answer, but I mean, the catalyst that sort of sent me on my way was The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. So that occupies a special place in my heart. And then also because later on, I made 2 movies that were also based on novels by Mordecai Richler,
Yes.
Barney's Version and Joshua Then and Now. I worked with Ted Kotcheff, who directed Duddy Kravitz, and the producer became my partner. So I had a lot of ties to that film. Nevertheless, you know, I've seen it many times since I first saw it in, I think, 1972 or 73, and it holds up. And so it's a favorite of mine. There are others. I think that I would put in the same category Denis Arcand's Le Déclin de l'Empire américain, and a Canada-France co-production that most people here probably don't know about, and no one thinks it's a Canadian film, but it was, called Quest for Fire,
Yes.
directed by Jean-Jacques Hano, starring Ray Don Chong, which I thought was a spectacular film.
It is.
And it got an Oscar nomination. So, I mean, those are, I am on purpose not mentioning my own films. And I'm finding it hard to be that modest, but I'm determined to stick to that.
I'll throw out Eastern Promises because I think that's one of my favorites.
Thank you.
I know you have a tight schedule tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to sit down and chat with you.
It was fun to be here, and you know, don't let me, you know, put you in a somber mood.
And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for watching. And if there's a question I forgot to ask Mr. Lantos, we're not going to give you his email, but we'll give you mine, and you could write in, and I'll try to get that answer for you. That's on your screen right now, along with my Twitter account. Thanks again for watching, and remember, keep making movies. It is the Canadian thing to do. Thank you.